with the added dollop of cringe that JDVance always brings to these things.
Well, that's the thing, and I think it probably bothers Donald Trump that he's willing to say these things. That's good, but he doesn't say them. He doesn't execute. You know, it comes out very cringy, very kind of awkward, unfortunately for him. But when he's lying, or when he's willing to push concepts that are, you know, Trump-esque, I think it must be hard. Must be hard for somebody who wrote Hillbilly Elegy to find himself at this point in his life. Here's Senator Vance accusing Governor Walz of retiring from the Minnesota National Guard in 2005 in order to avoid being deployed to Iraq. Take a look at this.
Well, you know what really bothers me about Tim Walz as a Marine who served his country in uniform? When the United States Marine Corps, when the United States of America asked me to go to Iraq to serve my country, I did it. I did what they asked me to do it, and I did it honorably, and I'm very proud of that service. When Tim Walz was asked by his country to go to Iraq, you know what he did? He dropped out of the Army and allowed his unit to go without him. What bothers me about Tim Walz is the stolen valor garbage.
So, in a moment of fact check, but first here's MSNBC's Chris Hayes on Walz's record and why he left the Guard.
Among the tiny fraction of Americans who enlist, a much smaller share make a career of it, serving 20 years or more with multiple deployments. And only a tiny fraction of those fought to stay in the service after being disabled on the job. And one of them is Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, an enlisted soldier in the National Guard for nearly a quarter of a century. A journey that began on a Nebraska farm as soon as he was eligible to join.
My father served during Korean War, and the day after I turned 17, he took me down to an Army National Guard recruiter, and I raised my hand and signed up.
That was in 1981. Ronald Reagan was president. Now, Walz continued to serve for the next 24 years under 4 commanders-in-chief. He spent most of that time as an artillery soldier, and it took a toll on his hearing. In fact, in 2002, after he'd already done 20 years, he qualified for retirement. A medical board considered discharging him because of his hearing impairment. Instead, he convinced them to let him complete his final enlistment, which began after 9/11. Walz achieved the highest enlisted rank in the Army, Command Sergeant Major. But rather than stay in and complete the schooling for that rank, Walz retired in 2005 at the rank of Master Sergeant. Party says because he wanted at that point to speak freely about political injustice, specifically the Iraq War. The following year, he was one of more than 60 anti-war veterans running for Congress, the Fighting Dems, a group that included Jim Webb, Patrick Murphy, and Tammy Duckworth.
I spent 24 years in the Army National Guard. I spent the better part of 2 decades as a public school teacher. I'm a small business owner, I'm a father, and I'm a husband. I intend to come here to Washington to provide authentic leadership and to truly represent the people of my district and the people of the United States.
Walz's experience in the armed forces is an atypical one for most Americans, particularly for politicians at the national level. I mean, there really is literally no one like him. And now Walz is running with Kamala Harris against Donald Trump and JDVance. And perhaps not that surprisingly, Republicans are trying to swift vote Walz, denigrating his service the way they did with Vietnam vet John Kerry 20 years ago, saying he stole valor and left the Army to avoid going to Iraq. It's a playbook Republicans also used against Walz when he ran for governor of Minnesota, and it failed then because they're lies. It turns out when voters hear about the quarter-century Walz spent as a citizen soldier, the time he spent since then fighting for Iraq and Afghanistan veterans to get the benefits they deserve, they don't see what Republicans do. They see a rare kind of veteran in politics who can cut through the self-serving BS rather than adding to it.
So here are the facts. According to Minnesota Public Radio, a medical board considered dismissing Walz in 2002 due to hearing problems he developed while working with high-powered weapons during his more than 2 decades in the National Guard. At that point, a guardsman who served under Walz says he was already openly discussing retiring in order to run for Congress. Records show that in January of 2005, he did indeed take that step and filed a statement of candidacy with the Federal Election Commission. 2 months later, Walz acknowledged in a campaign statement that there were talks about units potentially being deployed but wrote, quote, "I do not yet know if my artillery unit will be part of this mobilization." In May of that year, documents show he officially retired from the military, meaning he likely had to inform the National Guard of his plans many months earlier. In July of 2005, 6 months after Walz declared his intent to run for Congress, his former battalion received a mobilization alert, and then the following month, the order to deploy. Vance also accused Walz yesterday of lying about his rank of Command Sergeant Major. But in a new statement, the National Guard says the governor did indeed reach that level, though he, quote, retired as a Master Sergeant for benefit purposes because he did not complete additional coursework at the U.S. Army Sergeants Major Academy. Jonathan Lemire, again, different people do different types of service, and JDVance is going after Tim Walz and lining it with untruths, but also I feel like a service member denigrating another service member for his service is just, I don't know. I'm not sure how that's going to play. That may go in the JDVance category as well. We'll see.
Yeah, Governor Walz devoted 2 decades of his life to military service. And as you correctly note, JDVance served as well. Both men should be praised for doing so. This shouldn't be some sort of an attack line. And yes, we're expecting to hear more from the Harris campaign, clearing up a few little discrepancies. But the overall argument, as you just laid out in that fact check and as our colleague Chris Hayes did last night, it simply doesn't hold water. This idea of stolen valor, this idea that he bailed on his unit to avoid combat deployment. These are attacks that don't seem particularly honest, and it's unclear whether they will resonate. And Charlie Sykes, I think it's a couple other things need to be noted here. First of all, this just shows how the Trump team has really struggled to come up with any sort of effective attack lines against Vice President Harris, and now in these early days, her running mate. So they're seizing upon this. We should say, perhaps it's not too surprising, Chris LaCivita, who is one of the top Trump aides, he was the architect of the Swift boat attacks against John Kerry back in 2004. So this is a familiar playbook with him. Those also, many of them factually inaccurate. And then we should leave no conversation about political candidates' military services without noting that Donald Trump repeatedly dodged military service because he claimed he had bone spurs. And then later, when asked what foot they were in, couldn't remember.
No, exactly.
The one that was in his mouth.
I was going to use were bone spurs here. Look, I've spent a lot of time around veterans. I'm not a veteran myself, but one of the things I did in the before times was, to raise money to send World War II veterans to their memorial in Washington, D.C. And one of the points that we often made with the veterans was that all of their service was honorable, wherever they were, whether they were, radar operators or whether they were, in supplies. And this is what I think is so beneath JDVance here, to go after someone like Tim Walz, who served for 24 years and was disabled in his service, while JDVance, and again, we should thank him for his service, but he was not in combat either. But he has made he has kind of a penchant for attacking other members of the service, denigrating them. A while back, he was attacking General Barry McCaffrey. It seems to be kind of a thing for JDVance, but it is the dishonesty of all of this, reaching back into the Swift boat playbook to go after someone like Tim Walz, who spent, as you point out, 24 years, more than 2 decades, serving his country. And the timeline that you lay out is very clear. When he retired, look, people retire all the time from the military. This is not that radical. People in the military understand this, particularly when you have made a career of it. So I just think the attacks are potentially potent. But they are so fundamentally dishonest. I do hope, and I was listening to your discussion with Brendan Buck in the last hour, the Harris campaign has to take this seriously because, things like stolen valor can resonate. This is one of the things that the conservative media is very effective at getting out there to push out. And I think that they do need to engage. I do need they need to push back. But I also think that they need to go on the offensive about this, that a presidential ticket headed by Donald Trump, who used bone spurs to avoid service in Vietnam. The fact that a Donald Trump-led ticket would once again attack a member of the military who had served. I couldn't help but, think about his attacks on John McCain. I couldn't help but think about the reports in the Atlantic about the way that he had denigrated service members when he was president of the United States. This is not something that they should take lightly, and I don't think that they should be overly defensive about it. As you point out, if there are discrepancies, clear those discrepancies up. But this is honorable service, and there is just something particularly loathsome about JD Vance's decision to go after Tim Walz on this particular issue.